now we're going to sort of shift gears a little bit and move into another part of our program today, which is really hearing from some of the younger voices, younger scholars who are working in the area of women's rights. Our first panel is going to be chaired by my very dear friend and our colleague at UNSW, Professor Andrea Durbach. Andrea will be the discussant for a range of papers, and we will be hearing from the paper presenters through an earlier videoed presentation. So we're going to get the really incisive view of those papers from the paper presenters themselves, and then hear from Andrea as a discussant. The videos will be recorded, and the papers are also available on our website. So please let me hand over to Andrea. Thank her for being involved with us today, and to the wonderful presenters in this next session. Andrea.
Thank you, Louise, and good morning or good afternoon, everybody. And it's a great pleasure to be with you all. And my huge thanks to Hilary and Louise and the teams for getting together this extraordinary event. It really is. It's been a wonderful and exhilarating morning so far. So welcome, as Louise says, to the session on women's rights on the road to Beijing. And we have, as you've heard, 3 video presentations featuring our speakers, Anna Stevenson from the University of Free State, South Africa, Deirdre Brennan from the University of Melbourne in Australia, and Daniel Quiroga-Villamarin from the Graduate Institute in Geneva. I believe that Anna and Deirdre might in fact be in the audience or be delegates today, so welcome to you both. And after showing the 3 videos, I, as you've heard, will return with some observations. Just to note that given the very tight timeline, please, we're encouraging you all to post your questions and comments to the chat room. And Anna and Deirdre will be available to discuss these following the session during the afternoon tea break. So now to the respective videos. Thank you.
In the decades before the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women, a series of women's organisations committed themselves to the broad imperatives that would later gain greater significance on the global stage. The Black Sash of South Africa was one such organisation. Well known in South Africa, but little known in terms of scholarship about the global dimensions of women and social movements. Originally established in 1955 as the Women's Defence of the Constitution League, this organisation developed in the first decade of the apartheid government. Its initial membership comprised of white women who rejected the National Party's attempts to change the Constitution of South Africa in ways that would consolidate apartheid legislation. By the late 1950s, the organisation had transformed into the Black Sash. So named because of the black sashes its members had performatively draped over the country's constitution in mourning. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, the Black Sash became particularly dedicated to condemning the apartheid regime's human rights and women's rights abuses. In the process, the Black Sash became increasingly committed to the idea that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, although without this cutting clarity of phrase. Across these same decades, its members would actively expand their platform to address questions relating to poverty, education, healthcare, violence against women, armed conflict, economic inequality, and, of course, human rights. Many of these concerns would later be articulated as the critical areas of concern adopted in the 1995 Declaration and a Platform for Action. However, despite the liberal and sometimes even radical values that the Black Sash's members gradually adopted, it struggled to shake its legacy of being a white women's resistance organisation. During the 1950s, its focus on bringing together women as voters had resulted in limiting its membership to white women alone, because only white women had been enfranchised in South Africa in 1930. Although the Black Sash discarded this position of voters only by the early 1960s, the result was that it struggled to generate a multiracial membership of women across the subsequent decades. The Black Sash would ultimately remain constrained by the reality of its majority white membership. Despite the strong connections between the imperatives of both the Fourth World Conference on Women and the Black Sash, this organisation's ideas and praxis never quite managed to influence the women's movement beyond South Africa. In 2005, upon the 50th anniversary of the Black Sash, its national director, Marcella Naidoo, reflected upon how its membership of white women had used the relative safety of their privileged racial classification to speak out against the erosion of human rights in South Africa. Thank you.
Hello there. In my paper, you'll have read about the early 20th century campaigns for women's equal citizenship rights. In the early 1900s, a woman's nationality was dependent on that of her husband's in nearly every country in the world. And so feminist activists at the time, alongside those in the suffragette movement, were vigorously campaigning for a woman's independent right to acquire her nationality, to change it and to retain her nationality, say, for example, following the separation of a marriage. They were also fighting for women's ability to be able to pass their nationality on to their children. Now, the discovery of these campaigns was really something that was new to me. I'd never heard of them before, and new to anybody I spoke to who'd been working in the statelessness sector for the last 10 years or so. Statelessness is a really severe consequence of gender discriminatory nationality laws, especially when a woman can't pass on her nationality to her children. And it really appeared in the statelessness sector that momentum for the eradication of these laws had only picked up in the last 5 years or so, particularly 2014 with the launch of the global campaign for equal nationality rights. At least at a global level, it seemed like, it was the first of its kind. Now, that means that there was this huge century-wide gap almost between these two campaigns, and that momentum for eradicating gender discriminatory nationality laws was at its peak in the 1930s and slowly declined over the latter half of the century. And where momentum went to is something that I struggled with in the paper. It's not there's no clear-cut answer on it for me. So when the opportunity arose to present at this conference, it was really, it was a good chance for me to look at the Beijing conference in particular and see what work had been done in the last 30 years to draw attention again to this issue, to work towards eradicating gender discriminatory nationality laws. Unfortunately, as you may have read, the Beijing Platform for Action doesn't really say anything explicit on the issue. Today, in 2020, there are still 50 countries that discriminate against women in terms of their nationality. And so in 1995, the time of the Beijing conference, I can imagine there was, a lot more, at least 10 or 20 more countries with such restrictive laws. So, yeah, it's disappointing, but the question really that remains, the question that I pose to those listening is whether or not, well, first of all, I want to know if you yourself were aware that gender discriminatory nationality laws exist. If not, I wonder, why do you think that is? Because, you can really read in the paper there was such a colourful and powerful movement 100 years ago. Women did so much with so little compared to what we have now, and we're still really struggling to gain awareness on the issue. I wonder as well if there's a particular gaze. One thought that arose to me when thinking about issues that did get attention, like in the Beijing Platform for Action, the only very explicit mention of nationality is in regards to the girl child's right to acquire her nationality. So it doesn't say anything explicit about a woman's independent right to her nationality. Although granted it does, strive towards the removal of all gender discriminatory laws. But I'm kind of wondering if there is a particular gaze that we work through in women's rights advocacy. And nationality rights, it's not explicitly about women's trauma or women's victimhood. And as such, perhaps it's not as readily consumed. by media, by the general public? It's just a question that I'm left wondering with. So with all that said, it is unfortunate that, there wasn't an explicit role in 1995 by the Beijing Platform for Action to work towards the eradication of gender discriminatory nationality laws. 25 years later, we still have a quarter of countries in the world that uphold these laws. And so what can we do next to try and gain more attention and more momentum on the issue like there was 100 years ago? Thank you.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on which part of the world this video might find you. My name is Quiroga-Villamarin, and I'm a first-year PhD student and teaching assistant at the Graduate Institute Geneva. Today, I have the great pleasure of sharing with you some ideas of my paper, Wuthering Heights, Legal Materialities, Summit Diplomacy, and the Making of the World Stage at the Beijing International Convention Center in 1995. And I must first apologize because both the paper and this talk are still quite raw and tentative. This is not a finished product. It is very much a work in progress. And for the same reason, I'm more than open to any suggestions and feedback you might have as I continue working on this project. This paper in particular is what I envision Chapter 10 of my PhD thesis to become. And I should start by mentioning that my PhD thesis is tentatively entitled Architects of the Better World, the Birth of the International Conference Complex. In this project, what I try to do is to challenge, let's say, the traditional hegemonic approach in international legal history, which is, in my view, the intellectual or conceptual history. Now, I do not think that this approach has not been productive. I think it's very interesting. And I have myself done work in this vein. But I often felt that doing only intellectual conceptual history meant that we were often limiting ourselves to the ideas of old white European or American men and their legal doctrines. And what I'm trying to do with this project is to try to challenge this approach and instead foreground materiality in international legal history. I want to see what an approach or a perspective that puts objects, infrastructures, commodities, and space at the forefront of the conversation. What could it bring to our understandings of the past, present, and future of global governance? So in particular, the broad PhD project tracks the development of the International Conference Complex as an infrastructure for lawmaking and global governance. And in particular, in this chapter, what I'm interested in exploring from a science and technology studies perspective is how the particular specialities and materialities of the Beijing International Convention Center contributed to, let's say, the outcomes and the legal discourse of the Beijing conference. Now, I do not want to, let's say, create any strong arguments about material or technological determinism. Rather, what I want to see is how this particular space, its material relays, the spatial organization of the conference, provided its participants with certain opportunities, resources, and constraints in the handling of the negotiations. As you will see throughout the paper, what I want to do then is to focus on particular spaces and try to link them with the ways in which the conversation about the global protection of the rights of women went forward in this particular space. Sadly, for a myriad of reasons, and in particular, due to the many disruptions related to COVID and archival research, I haven't been able to present to you a very advanced paper, but rather a quite tentative plan of how I want to go forward into exploring, let's say, these different spatial concerns within and beyond Beijing Conference Center. But I thank all of you for your attention, and I look forward to the fascinating discussion that will happen throughout the conference. Many thanks.
Well, thank you so much to Anna, Deirdre, and Daniel for your papers and presentations. As the title of the session speaks to the issues of women's rights that would no doubt have informed the national and international preparation in the lead up to the landmark Beijing conference in 1995, I think what strikes me about all of them, particularly those from Anna and Deirdre, was how they address issues critical to women's rights that were in fact omitted from the 12 areas of concern which the Beijing Declaration highlighted as necessary to ensuring greater equality for women and girls. And that's, to echo what was said in the panel before, not in any way to deflect from the remarkable boldness at the time of those 12 areas, and certainly to acknowledge, I think, Di Otto's very important point about the struggle to address and accommodate issues of diversity within a framework of universality. 25 years later, after Beijing 95, the pervasive and entrenched impact of race and nationality on women's access to resources and power remain fundamental to the struggle for women's equality and empowerment. And the extent to which race and nationality, highlighted by Anna and Deirdre's papers, continue to limit and prevent women's equality and exacerbate their inequality, underscores the importance, in my view, of revisiting their intertwining with gender at a fora such as this. And in that respect, and to return to the points made earlier by Kate Jenkins and Christine Chinkin, it's interesting to note that only 5 years before Beijing 95, Kimberly Crenshaw famously described how race, class, gender, and other characteristics shaping women's experience intersect and overlap. And she importantly clarified that intersectionality was not really concerned with, and I quote, shallow questions of identity and representation, but more interested in the deep structural and systemic questions about discrimination and inequality, as I think is reflected in the notions of race and nationality. Anna Stevenson's paper takes up the pivotal claim that underpinned the 95 Beijing Platform for Action, namely women's rights are human rights. And she does this by tracing this claim through the evolution of an anti-apartheid organization called the Black Sash. 40 years before the Fourth World Conference on Women in September 95, the Black Sash, then known as the Women's Defense of the Constitution League, was established, initially led and driven by white middle-class South African women, as we heard. The membership and activities of the Black Sash were driven by the political imperatives of the time. It was a predominantly white women's organization focused on the inhumanities of apartheid, as they impacted men and women, primarily Black. And so the iniquitous manifestation of racism, not the violence of gender inequality, was a strong determinant of the Black Sash strategy. And although Black women in South Africa at that point certainly faced a double-barreled oppression, being casualties of gender and of race, the rights of women per se were not the central tenet of the Black Sash endeavour. Rather, its members, initially and primarily white, had a broader deliberate focus on exposing and condemning the human rights abuses of South Africa's apartheid regime. And in so doing, as Anna seeks to illustrate, the rights of women were tangentially realised as the organisation began a tentative embrace of feminism. And as South African historian Cheryl Walker observed, and I quote, "The sight of white middle-class women, well-dressed, well-spoken, well-behaved, demonstrating against the apartheid government outraged many of their supporters. Frequently, the women were exposed to verbal abuse and threats of violence. Not only were they defying the government, but they were also defying a set of unwritten rules about what was seemly and proper conduct for women," close quotes. This pernicious intersection of race and gender is a latter theme in the paper by Deirdre Brennan, who uncovers a really fascinating history of women's rights activism around the idea of citizenship equality, from the period of Napoleonic France to the Beijing Platform for Action. And she highlights statelessness as the invidious consequence of gender discriminating nationality laws for millions of children born to mothers in almost 25 countries where women do not have the same right as men to pass on their nationality. Her paper asks how gender discriminatory nationality laws, which in essence make women's nationality dependent on that of their husbands, have or have not been addressed during such historical moments as Beijing 95 and beyond. Her answer for the contemporary world, which seems somewhat inconceivable given the gains of women's struggles globally, is that in 2020, close to 50 countries continue to discriminate against women in regard to their nationality. And while, as Deirdre points out, Beijing presented an opportunity to resurrect the focus and far-reaching impact of gender discriminatory nationality laws, which had lost momentum since the interwar period, the Beijing Declaration's only reference to the issue was in relation to the girl child. As Deirdre concludes, and I quote, "This singular focus on nationality solely through the eyes or the lens of the rights of the girl child overlooks the importance of eradicating gender discriminatory nationality laws for women in their own right." And so almost a century after the campaigns around nationality and women began, the impact of nationality has been forgotten, as Deirdre demonstrates, on multiple levels, one of which, to return to Anna's paper, is the way in which nationality and immigration laws affect women of colour. And so, perhaps to a less tangible but equally unacknowledged presence of a critical factor that, like race and nationality, shapes responses to women's inequality. Daniel Quiroga-Villamarin shifts us to a focus on a more abstracted notion, that of constituted political and cultural space, and the inarticulated impact of space on transnational lawmaking at Beijing 95 and beyond. Drawing on recent work by feminist geographers who have demonstrated how urban and architectural planning often follows the needs and visions of men, Daniel suggests that the construction of conference spaces might not be that different. Interrogating the infrastructure arrangements that shaped the Beijing 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women, Daniel argues that scant, and I quote, "if any attention was paid to how space itself constrained and enabled those who attended the global theatre, as he calls it, of Beijing 95. Goodness knows how Daniel might interrogate and interpret the impact of this virtual conference space on our deliberations and outcomes. But to give voice to the invisibility of another critical and influential factor, as he does, to the intersections between the built and the imagined, the concrete intervention of space, enables a coming into view and an acknowledgement of its salience. And I would add a further dimension to Daniel's exploration by reference to the presentation of Anna and Deirdre's papers in conclusion. That despite race and nationality not explicitly being foregrounded as one of the 12 areas of concern of the 95 Beijing Declaration, for centuries, women around the world in their own countries have claimed and will continue to claim space in a man-made world, to quote feminist geographer Leslie Caron. To resist, to expose, to transform discriminatory practices. And in doing so, women have redrawn the boundaries of interaction and negotiation, creating space where once there was none. And indeed, that's exactly how the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action came into being. Thank you all for your attendance, and I look forward to your questions to our presenters, who will then be available to follow up in the chat room during the break this afternoon.
Many thanks, Andy. Lovely to see you there through the ether. Thank you so much for your very thoughtful commentary, and to our three paper presenters, all so different. But I must say that it's these. I think these papers from our more recent researchers are ones that are a source of optimism for all of those, for us in the academy. Such a rich range of things, from recovering topics that haven't been dealt with to proposing new ways of thinking about them. So we want to thank those, and we're going to have a feast of similar programs in the afternoon. I'm really conscious that because of our virtual format, it's not possible for us to actually engage actively with the questions. As Andy has said, the best way you can do things is perhaps to put questions to the presenters in the chat, and hopefully they will read those. But we will have this chance to meet with the presenters in their own breakout rooms during our next break. So I encourage you to, you'll be able to see which groups are which, and I encourage you to join those. But now it's my occupational health and safety duty to tell everybody they need to get up from their computers wherever you are. Some of us are lucky enough, this is perfect lunchtime in Eastern Australian time. I'm conscious that won't be the same for everybody. We're just taking a break till 10 minutes past 1, and what's going to happen is our hardworking, all the wonderful tech staff, the backup people that you're not seeing who are working so hard, are going to take a break. There will be some rolling content on the screen if you want to watch that while you eat your sandwiches, but we encourage you really to try and see if you can get out or do a little bit of exercise. But we look forward to meeting up again at 1:10. So thank you so much again, Andy, for launching us this new experimental format. But I think you've shown us how rich and productive it can be, even with the limits of time and space. So farewell, everybody, and see you again just after the lunch break.